ball. Start by pressing it out, pressing out all that air. And I always put the skin side down. The smooth skin side is what goes down because that will be the outside of the dough. And if I need help, if it's a stretchy dough, again, I'll use the rolling pin. But you wonder, how do you get it thicker in the center and more tapered on the sides? The easiest way to do that is by starting off by making a peak. See, now that's going to be the fuller center. And then bring that peak around, forward, and press the dough back. And then bring it forward again. And use your thumbs to seal the dough by making a seam all the way across the dough. So it's now at the bottom of the dough. And then roll that seam so it's right in the middle. And then you can adjust it a little like this. And now this is the final rise. This is going to be the third rise for this bread. And that's before baking. So I start preheating my oven because for bread, we want it to go into a really hot oven and add steam, add ice cubes to create steam, and that's what gives it the wonderful crust and a really good burst rise in the oven. So what am I going to bake it on? I prefer doing it on this non-stick paper, but I want to keep it covered to keep this from crusting. So either I use greased plastic wrap, but the absolute best thing to use is a big plastic box. You can find them anywhere. They're really inexpensive. I put 4 or 2 little custard cups of hot water from the tap. I change it every 30 minutes. And I'm creating my own sort of proof box, my own tropical environment for the bread. Now I'm going to check and see if the bread has risen enough. It still has a lovely shape, but you can see how much more puffy it is. Now, why do you think it's important to know exactly how much it's risen? Has it risen enough or has it risen too much? If you've let it rise to the point where when I stick a finger in, it really holds the impression and doesn't pop up at all, that means that when you put it in the oven, it's not going to continue rising as much. And so when I make the slashes, those slashes won't open up. Whereas if I let it under-rise slightly, then they open up beautifully. If I let it under-rise too much, then they open up hugely and they crack. When that happens to you, you know you didn't let it rise long enough. So when I press it with my finger, it should hold the impression and gradually fill in. And I like to use a straight-edged razor. Be careful with it because they're very sharp, but that's why they work so well to slash the bread. And if I feel like I've risen it just exactly right, which this is, I can make a fairly deep, like a 1/4-inch slash. But say by mistake I let it rise too much, I'll just make 1/8 of an inch deep. And that way it won't look funny because it isn't rising enough. And then to further ensure that I get a crisp crust, I'm going to spray it with a water mister, just lightly, and there's only fresh water in there. And now it's ready to go into the oven. And the oven is really hot. It's 400 degrees because the minute you open that oven door, it's going to go down at least 25 degrees. Also, be prepared because I'm going to be putting some ice cubes in the tray that's been preheating along with the rest of the oven to create steam. Avert your face when you do it. Do it quickly to keep the steam in the oven. So I have a hot baking stone, and you can see the roasting pan is there as well. I'm going to have to pull it forward to make sure the ice cubes hit it. The baking stone keeps the oven heat and makes the bottom of the bread start rising right away. And now quickly put in, there's a little water that's fine too, about a 1/2 cup of the ice cubes. I don't know if you saw the burst of steam, but believe me, it was there. And let it bake for 5 minutes, and then lower the heat by 25 degrees. If you're using a convection oven, you start 25 degrees lower for both settings because it bakes that much hotter. Convection ovens are very even, and so you don't have to turn the bread in the oven halfway through. But if you're using a regular oven, about 20 minutes into the baking, I turn the bread around. It's still dough at that point because it hasn't fully baked. And then I bake it until it reaches the point where if I take a thermometer and put it right in the center of the bread, it will register 190 degrees. It can go up to 210. You don't have to worry about over baking it. But if you find, because the cranberries and the malt make the dough sweet, that it starts caramelizing and getting a little dark, tent it loosely with foil at the point where you see that's happening. So here I have the finished cranberry walnut bread. And I allow it to cool on a wire rack until it's completely cool. I know everybody loves warm bread or hot bread, but part of the baking process is the cooling. It's continuing to cook. In fact, you can even hear the crust on certain breads. They call it the song of the bread, bakers, as the crust is cooling and you hear it actually crackling. And that's all part of the process. So if you want to eat the bread warm, just put it back in the oven, 350 for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you'll have your warm bread and it'll be correctly cooked as well. And of course use a serrated bread knife because that way it doesn't compress the layers. I actually like this bread sliced fairly thin. And I eat it with butter or just by itself because there's so much going on. The nuts have oil, there's sugar in the cranberries, that it really doesn't need anything. I've got to try some. I love this bread. It is so delicious. It may seem like a lot of steps, but really it's very easy, and it makes you feel so good, and then you get to eat it. If you never tried baking bread, go out and do it. You can see with the instant yeast, you can't go wrong. I'm Rose Levy Beranbaum with Baking Magic.